A tomb built into a hillside, sealed for 3,500 years, gave up something it shouldn't have. Inside were bones, Bronze Age, catalogued, unremarkable at first glance. Geneticists pulled DNA from them anyway, because that's the routine now, and ran the comparison against the living population still farming the valley below. The match was too close. Not close in the way ancient and modern DNA is usually close, a faint genetic echo across a few thousand years of migration and mixing. This was close like a signature compared to itself. The people in that valley today carry genomes that barely moved in 3.5 millennia, while almost everyone else on the same continent got rewritten, more than once, by armies and traders and empires that came and went. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty, but the data kept saying the same thing every time they ran it. Something on this island refused to change. The island is Sardinia, and the story most people already know about it is the postcard version. Ancient towers called Nuragic dotting a rugged coastline, a Mediterranean culture that feels older than Rome, because in some ways it is. Historians will tell you Sardinia sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, brushed by Phoenician traders, briefly claimed by Carthage, absorbed into the Roman Republic, passed later between Byzantines, Pisans, Aragonese, and eventually the Kingdom of Italy. On paper, it reads like every other Mediterranean island, conquered, reconquered, layered with outsiders the way Sicily was, the way Malta was, the way nearly every scrap of coastline in that sea eventually was. That's the consensus story. Contact, absorption, blending. It's a reasonable story. It fits the pattern of the whole region. Here is where it gets complicated. The genetics don't fit the pattern. When researchers sequenced ancient Sardinian remains spanning from the Neolithic farming period through the Bronze Age and into more recent history, and then compared those genomes to Sardinians alive today, they found a population that had barely absorbed any of the invasions its own history books describe. A team publishing through Nature Communications in 2020 traced this continuity directly, showing that modern Sardinian DNA remains unusually close to the island's earliest farming populations that arrived roughly 8,000 years ago, and genetically speaking, never really left. Mainland Europe doesn't look like this. In most of Europe, a wave of Bronze Age migrants from the Eurasian steppe swept through around 5,000 years ago and substantially overwrote the DNA of the earlier farming populations that came before them, a well-documented event that reshaped ancestry from Britain to the Balkans. Sardinia barely felt it. The steppe signal that shows up almost everywhere else in Europe is faint here, sometimes nearly absent. A haplogroup, think of it as a genetic surname, passed down not on paper but in the body itself, that mainland Europeans inherited from those steppe migrants, is comparatively rare in Sardinian bloodlines. The island kept an older surname. Almost everyone else changed theirs. The first theory is the simple one, and it's mostly geography. Sardinia's interior is mountainous, difficult, historically poor farmland compared to its coasts, but its coasts, for most of the last 2,000 years, were a death trap. Malaria was endemic along the Sardinian coastline well into the 20th century, discouraging the kind of large-scale coastal settlement that let outsiders take root elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Invaders came, took ports, extracted taxes, and largely left the interior alone, because the interior wasn't worth the climb and the coast wasn't worth the fever. Clean explanation, convenient. It accounts for a lot. It doesn't account for everything. The second theory is more complicated, and it has to do with culture rather than terrain. Even where contact did happen, intermarriage seems to have been limited by something more deliberate than geography: tight kinship networks, village-level endogamy, a preference for marrying within the community that persisted long after any given occupying power had come and gone. This is the part the records don't explain well, because nobody was writing down marriage patterns in Bronze Age hill villages. Researchers infer it from the DNA itself, clusters of relatedness within small regions that are tighter than pure isolation by distance would predict. Isolation from outsiders is a landscape effect. Isolation within a landscape, village by village, is a human choice, made over and over, for reasons the genome preserves but doesn't explain. The third theory, and the one researchers tend to state more cautiously than the other two, is timing. Sardinia's worst depopulation events, waves of disease, famine, and displacement across its history, may have repeatedly thinned the population down to a small surviving core before it had the chance to blend with the outsiders who periodically arrived. A population bottleneck, in other words, a demographic choke point that a small number of survivors pass through, carrying a disproportionate share of the group's genetic future with them. Not by years, by generations of near collapse and slow regrowth. Each time it happened, the surviving core was, statistically, more Sardinian and less anyone else. The data doesn't confirm this drove the pattern on its own, it only fails to rule it out. Picture the geography doing its work in real time. A trading ship pulls into a Sardinian harbor sometime in antiquity, Phoenician maybe, or Carthaginian. The crew unloads goods, maybe stays the season, maybe leaves a few sailors behind who marry local women and root themselves in a coastal town. That's contact. That's exactly the kind of event that reshaped Sicily, reshaped Crete, reshaped half the Mediterranean coastline over the centuries. But the fever season comes, the garrison thins, the ambitious families who might have pushed inland, intermarried further, built lasting dynasties. Many of them don't survive the mosquitoes long enough to matter demographically. Meanwhile, in a village 40 kilometers inland, in the hills, nothing has changed at all. No ships reach that high, no garrisons bother. Life continues on a genetic loop that started when farming first arrived on the island, 8,000 years before anyone in that coastal town was born. And here the story stops being simple. Because the twist isn't that Sardinia stayed isolated. Isolated populations exist all over the world. It's a known category, not a shocking one on its own. The twist is what that isolation turned out to be for. Sardinia's tightly preserved genome, the very thing that kept the island's ancestry old, is now one of the most valuable resources in modern medical genetics. Because Sardinians share so much genetic background with each other and carry comparatively little of the noise introduced by centuries of outside mixing, researchers can spot disease-linked mutations in Sardinian populations that would be nearly invisible to find in a more genetically blended group like, say, the population of mainland Italy or the United States. Work published in Nature Genetics identified rare gene variants tied to cardiovascular traits using Sardinian family cohorts, specifically because the reduced genetic background noise made the signal easier to isolate. A needle that's actually visible because the haystack is smaller. The isolation that history treated as a footnote turned out to be a scientific instrument. A geneticist working on one of these projects put it plainly to a colleague once. The island didn't just survive its own history, it kept a record of everyone else's. The same pattern, with different mechanisms, shows up elsewhere. In the Pyrenees, the Basque people speak a language with no confirmed relatives anywhere on Earth, not Indo-European, not connected to any neighboring tongue, a linguistic island sitting in the middle of a linguistic continent. Their genetics tell a parallel story to Sardinia's. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that Basque ancestry retains an unusually strong signal from Iron Age and earlier populations, with less of the steppe-derived ancestry that swept through most of the rest of Western Europe. Mountains again. A hard place to invade, a harder place to stay. Finland tells it differently. No mountain range isolated the Finns. Instead, a small founding population and a cultural and linguistic boundary did the work that geography did elsewhere. Finnish belongs to the Uralic language family, not Indo-European, setting it apart from its Scandinavian neighbors the same way Basque sits apart from Spanish and French. That boundary appears to have limited intermarriage with surrounding populations for long enough that a set of rare hereditary conditions, now known collectively as the Finnish disease heritage, became concentrated in the population. Genetic conditions that are vanishingly rare elsewhere, but recur often enough in Finland that they have their own name in the medical literature. Researchers studying Finnish population structure, including a large, fine-scale analysis published in the mid-2000s, found strikingly clear regional genetic clustering even within Finland itself, evidence of a population that stayed put, generation after generation, in tightly bounded communities. And then there's a group that breaks the pattern entirely, because they're not isolated from a shared starting point at all. The San peoples of southern Africa carry the deepest branch on the entire human family tree. Every other population alive today, everywhere on Earth, split off from a shared ancestral lineage more recently than the sand did. Genome sequencing published in Nature found that sand genetic diversity within their own communities exceeds the diversity found across entire other continents combined. They're not an isolated branch of something else. They're closer to the root. The name was changed by outsiders more than once. The land was mapped by people who never lived on it. The story was told, for centuries, by everyone except the population it was actually about. Isolation, told from the outside, sounds like emptiness, like nothing happened there. Told from the inside, or through the DNA itself, it sounds like something closer to memory. A record kept not on paper, not in language, but in the body, passed down cell by cell while everything else moved. Zoom out far enough, and this stops being a story about one island, one mountain range, one linguistic boundary. It's a story about what stillness actually costs and what it preserves. Every population that mixed, nearly all of them, nearly everywhere, gained something from it. New crops, new immunities, new alliances, new futures. What they lost was a version of themselves that reached back further than memory. The populations that didn't mix, the ones geography or culture sealed off long enough to matter, kept that older self intact, not because they were protected from history, but because history simply never found the door. And now that door is closing on its own. Modern mobility, modern intermarriage, does in a single generation what malaria and mountains and language barriers held off for thousands of years. The isolated genomes researchers study today may not exist in the same form a century from now. This population has barely mixed in 10,000 years. Whatever comes next, for the first time in all that time, is already underway.